This is an excerpt of a longer poem by Julia Hamilton, A Prayer for the Post Office. This is a nonpartisan prayer about something as mundane as mail, as gentle as the swish of a letter falling to the floor by the door. This is a prayer for stamps and stamp collectors, the quietest of hobbies, for pen pals and thank you card writers, for grandparents who always remember your birthday, and love letters from the war, kept at the bottom of a drawer. This is a prayer for the quiet dignity of the blue mailbox, standing like a sentinel on the corner portal to anywhere for just the cost of a stamp. Do you remember the wonder of it? Dropping a letter in one place, mouth of the box swinging open and shut, eating the envelope like Cookie Monster, only to have that same letter reappear days later in another place? It is a mundane miracle. A simple thing, feeling like part of something, a community maybe, where mail carriers and teenage drivers are all part of the same world. I remember how quickly he would run up and down the front steps, even in the hot and humid summer. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. This is a prayer for the carriers on their routes, the clerk at the window, the back room sorters, and the delivery truck drivers, moving mountains, one piece at a time, passing along that which was entrusted to them. Electric bills, bank statements, birthday cards, ballots. Hear us, God of the taken for granted things, divine mystery of overnight delivery, spirit of civic life. May we preserve this minor magic of letter and stamp, scale and package, sorting machine and postbox, so that our children do not shake their heads and wonder at all the things we allowed to slip away. Again, that was from Reverend Julia Hamilton. My grandmother has always been an amazing birthday card writer. She'll pull a photo from her collection and make a card with it, usually a photo of one of her grandchildren as a child. She'll write a brief note, but one that expresses a specific and deep and unconditional love. This summer, when I got my birthday card, my grandmother returned to me a letter that I had written to her when I was 9 years old. And here it is with my very serious cursive handwriting. Happy St. Patrick's Day, it says. And strangely, I remember very well everything that I mentioned in this letter from 1984. The story I had written for my class and the neighbor's wedding and the fundraiser for another neighbor who was in the hospital, the baby chicks we had at the time. And I wonder, actually, if I remember these things so well because I wrote them down. Love, Laura, it says. And then P.S., I have a cold. I don't remember having the cold, but my current 9-year-old daughter thinks that that is just hilarious that I wrote, P.S. I have a cold. There is something about having an actual physical piece of mail and seeing a person's handwriting that reminds you of the quiet moment they took to move their hand across a page and express some words just to you. I suspect many of us, used to write handwritten letters much more often than we do now. In my 20s, especially with friends scattered all over after college, we sent each other letters with long updates about the dramas in our life, and sometimes we would decorate the envelopes, and sometimes we would stick in a mixtape just to share what we were listening to. And now we post an update to Facebook. And I confess, it is easier to send an email or even a short text saying, thinking of you, how are you doing? It goes immediately and is received immediately, and sometimes carries the expectation that it will be replied to immediately. Now, there is definitely a place for these quick check-ins. I'm actually very grateful, especially in these days, that we have these ways of staying connected. But what about the handwritten note or letter? Where is its place today? And what gets expressed differently when we sit down with pen and paper to write? In 1821, Professor Thomas Hill wrote a manual on letter writing for either business or personal correspondence. A letter, he wrote, is, quote, but just talk on paper. And he had guidelines for a good letter. Be original, because you are not exactly like anyone else. Speak from the heart. Do not send a list of petty complaints, but offer hope and say only what is needed and no more. I think of Emily Dickinson's love letters to her friend and possible lover, Susan Gilbert, as examples of letters that are certainly original and from the heart. In 1852, just a year after Professor Hill wrote his manual, Emily and Susan were separated for a while. So here's an excerpt of one letter that Emily wrote. June 11th, 1852. I have but one thought, Susie, this afternoon of June, and that of you. And I have one prayer only, dear Susie, that is for you. I need you more and more, and the great world grows wider, and dear ones fewer and fewer every day that you stay away. I miss my biggest heart. My own goes wandering round and calls for Susie. What a love letter. And a place, maybe, to say a truth that could perhaps not be shared out loud anywhere else. Or consider a different kind of letter. Maybe call it a self-love letter written in 1864 by a man named Jordan Anderson. Jordan had been freed from enslavement in Tennessee for just a year when he received a letter from his old master asking him to return to work for pay on the plantation. Apparently, they couldn't do without him. Jordan responds with a letter of his own, and this letter is quite cordial, very polite, but in response to the request, he says, quote, "We have concluded to test your sincerity by asking you to send us our wages for the time we served you. This will make us forget and forgive old scores and rely on your justice and friendship in the future. I served you faithfully for 32 years, and my wife Mandy 20 years. At $25 a month for me and $2 a week for Mandy, our earnings would amount to $11,680. Add to this the interest for the time our wages have been kept back, and deduct what you paid for our clothing and 3 doctor's visits to me and pulling a tooth for Mandy, and the balance will show that what we are in justice entitled to. Please send the money by Adams Express. If you fail to pay us for faithful labors in the past, we can have little faith in your promises in the future. Needless to say, this was a letter of truth-telling, and Jordan Anderson never returned to that Tennessee plantation. You know, the practice of writing a letter can connect you to yourself, who you truly are, and remind you what are your unique words that you have to share. Like journaling a letter that gives news of your life can be a time of self-reflection, self-knowledge discovered in the writing. In fact, it can be a deeply important healing exercise to write letters to people who will never receive them. To write out a letter to someone with whom you have had a broken relationship, saying things that you may never be able to say to them in person, can be healing. It can be healing to write a letter to a person who has died, perhaps saying the things you wish you had said when they were living. I just finished reading a novel, actually. The whole book, the whole story is structured as a letter from a son to a mother who can't read and will never read his letter, but there was something powerful and connecting and healing in writing it all out. Letter writing can also help you feel connected in the moment to someone, like having a conversation, even though you may be far, far away from each other. In July of 1967, 27-year-old First Lieutenant Dean Allen wrote to his wife Joyce from Vietnam. He wrote, "There are many times while I am out in the field that I really feel the need to talk to you. Not so much about us, but what I have on my mind. Writing doesn't really do that much good because you aren't here to answer me or discuss something. I guess it helps a little though, because you are the only one I would say these things to. Maybe sometime I'll even try to tell you how scared I have been or am now. I love you with all my heart, all my love always, Dean." It was just 4 days later that Dean Allen was killed in action. Perhaps writing this letter, sharing his heart, helped him to feel less scared and less alone. Letters, of course, can also impact the person receiving them, not just the writer, and maybe many others into the future that you can't even imagine. Back in 1851, Professor Hills wrote, quote, "You little dream how much you will influence your future, how much your letter may give of hope and happiness to the one receiving it, how much it may be examined, thought of, laughed over, and commented on. And when you suppose it has long since been destroyed, it may be brought forth, placed in type and published to millions of readers. I don't think my letter to my grandmother is ever going to get published to millions of readers, but think about the letters of the poet Rainer Maria Rilke. In one of his series of letters that have been published as letters to a young poet, he writes, "So don't be frightened, dear friend, if a sadness confronts you larger than any you have ever known, casting its shadow over all you do. You must think that something is happening within you, and remember that life has not forgotten you. It holds you in its hand and will not let you fall." I can't speak to the impact that Rilke's letters had on the poet to whom he wrote, but these private letters have since gone on to impact generations of people, including me. And then, of course, there are the letters that are meant to be public letters. Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail was written in 1963 as he sat in jail as a public, open letter to more moderate white clergy in Birmingham. But it continues to call my conscience like he is writing directly to me today. Here's just a brief excerpt. "I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another person's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. Something about the fact that this is a letter and not an essay makes it very clear about who it is for. It is addressed to me. It is addressed to many of you. With the news of this last week, the last few weeks, the last year, maybe it seems nostalgic or sentimental to be talking about old-fashioned letter writing. But as we continue to keep our physical distances, and as we seem to be politically splitting further and further apart in this country, I think we need to cultivate those practices that help us connect with ourselves and keep us knit together with others. We might need to support each other in being disciplined about these practices. So this fall, I'll be offering a series of drop-in letter writing sessions. Consider it a spiritual practice. You don't need to bring anything fancy, just a notepad and some pens and yourself. Each time we gather, we'll hear an excerpt from a letter that's in the public domain, and I'll provide some letter writing prompts. Sometimes it will be an invitation to write a certain kind of letter. We've talked about many different kinds of letters just now. Sometimes I'll have names and addresses of people in the congregation to send a card to, and sometimes it will be writing letters to people who you don't know, but folks in the community, perhaps, who could use some encouragement and connection. We've already had an invitation to write letters to families and children who are in the Family Promise Shelter and Transitional Housing Program in our community. And some of you have already been writing letters to detainees at the Stewart Immigration Detention Center. Perhaps we'll even do some nonpartisan get out the vote postcard writing. And of course, you will be welcome to write to whomever you wish. So I want to invite you to join me in this practice. Let's do our small part in writing hope for each other, writing hope for our future. May it be so. Amen. Love, Laura.